Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back to the recent past of Gran Turismo and GT6, to another vehicle that I believe is worth consideration again because it has a decent to even in some cases good chance of returning in the future, and it's an opportunity for those of us who maybe haven't played the previous games to take a look at some of the cars which were featured that you might not have known about, and maybe for those of us who have been a part of the series and the franchise for a longer time, to kind of reminisce, to take a look down memory lane to some degree, to consider some of the coolest cars that we don't have anymore, and actually to reevaluate, you know what, do I really want this car to come back? Is it perhaps not as much of an important car as I once remembered? There are many cars, for instance, that a lot of people still want back and probably always will, such as the Lexus LFA, for instance. There are others that certain people seem, at least, to have kind of cooled down on. The one that surprised me, actually, was recently in this same series. I reviewed the Honda HSV10, the Super GT 500 car. And in GT6, that car was a force to be reckoned with, and a massively popular car in the community. So many people love that car, and although many people still do, it does surprise me actually how few people seem to be asking for it to come back. It's almost like most people have forgotten how good it was and how much they loved it, whereas for some reason certain cars definitely endure more than others, like the LFA does. Now this one is another one of those that kind of falls into the HSV camp, somewhat funnily enough, because it was another car that was extremely OP, one of the ultimate loophole vehicles, if you will, in the previous game, because in a similar way to how the Aston Martin Vulcan is treated in GT Sport, that was kind of how this car was treated in GT6, and that is kind of a no man's land. Not quite a full-on race car, not quite a road car, but a lot of lobbies would allow it. That always irked me because the FXX is categorically not a street car, in the same way that the Vulcan isn't. There was one road-going modification, likewise with the FXX, but all the others were not. So it's about as ridiculous as allowing a Zonda R into a road-going lobby. And speaking of the Zonda R, that was easily this car's best rival in GT6 with the Mazda Furai, maybe a little bit behind. It didn't have the sheer power, and certainly not the straight-line performance that these two had, but it could match them through corners. Now the Zonda R, of course, did come back. So far it's the only Pagani in GT Sport, and a pretty powerful one, a pretty strong one all round to have, but of course it has the cursed Group X category moniker, and I would actually argue that this car, the FXX, would fit really well, at least on paper, into GT Sport. Now I think the problem is, it would almost certainly be in Group X, just like, of course, the Zonda R, but actually another new fantastic contender to go up against them, of course, the McLaren P1 GTR. Now, something about the FXX which I believe a lot of people do not give it credit for is that it kind of started this trend that we still have to this day of track-only hypercars. Because if you think before this, there really weren't that many of those. You had, of course, the most notable GT1 street cars, but that's not really the same thing. They were, as I said, street cars for one thing. And apart from that, what did you have? Maybe a Lamborghini Diablo GTR, and that was about it. There wasn't really much else, not that I can think of off the top of my head anyway. Most of them were street homologated Le Mans cars, and that was pretty much the most hardcore thing you could buy. But then this comes along, and very shortly after, of course, the Maserati equivalent, the MC12 Corsa, which obviously I prefer, and a number of others down the line, some of which were expressly designed for racing and just didn't make it. Koenigsegg, unfortunately, with the CCGT. Others, though, were never designed to race to begin with. They were more of a test bed or a privateer, you know, buyer's weekend racer sort of thing, and that is exactly what the FXX was. It was not designed to be a GT1 car, unlike the F50 GT was. This was not designed to take Le Mans or something like that. It was a basically manufacturer spec series for private customers. Think of it as the Renault Clio Cup on a multi-million-dollar budget instead, with V12 engines. And curiously, and I think a pretty cool perk of the series, was that the drivers and customers who were involved in the FXX program, and I'm sure they carry this on to this day with stuff like the K version as well, they actually had a hand in developing the future cars and elements of how the future cars would feel from Ferrari. So I have no doubt whatsoever that at least some of the driver feedback and the notes from this very car probably influenced the LaFerrari. Very literally, I would think, and probably some other models as well. So in terms of importance to Ferrari, the FXX is massive. It's one of the most important modern cars they've built. In fact, just like the Enzo was for the street, this was hugely important for the track. And speaking of the Enzo, this car definitely supersedes it in a number of ways. This is not just the same thing with a larger wing and more downforce and sticky tyres, it's so much more than that. Even the engine itself is larger, it's a 6.3 litre instead of a 6 litre, of course still naturally aspirated V12. Obviously mid-engine rear-wheel drive, a ton more downforce. One of my favourite little quirks about this car was always that they actually swapped where the brake lights and exhaust outlets were to make them the opposite, so the brakes are now at the bottom and the exhausts are at the top. I always found that kind of cool. And in terms of the spec, it's not as strong as something like a LaFerrari is even on the street, but of course this was not a hybrid. So 788 horsepower purely from that V12, which is a phenomenal engine. Not the torquiest motor out there, but again, not too surprising. F1 derived tech in the Enzo, that was kind of the point. And it actually had 506 pound-feet, incidentally. And even though the FXX was not designed as a GT1, and again, unlike the MC12, was not a force to be reckoned with in GT1, it actually weighs about the same as a GT1 car from the 2000s, 1155 kilos. So that's actually pretty good. About 5 kilos more, I believe, than something like the Maserati or the Saleen S7R. So in terms of spec, it's very, very strong. And of course, just like the Pagani Zonda R, because it doesn't have to fit within those regulations, it has way more power than those GT1s had. They had, I believe, between 600 and about 630 horsepower typically. This, as I said, with 788, significantly higher. Now, there are only, I would say, two arguable drawbacks to the FXX. One is the price. It's 2 million credits, which is pretty hefty. That's literally on par with many Le Mans prototypes in the game, and it's certainly not as quick as those around the track. However, the other potential downside kind of ties into that, and that is that many people found it very challenging to drive, because unlike the Zonda R, the FXX isn't all that forgiving. Now, I would not say it's as challenging as many people claim. I actually have the hot take that the FXX was easier to drive than the LaFerrari is, even though it's a road car in GT Sport, and that car was notorious in its own right, especially when the game first came out. But at the same time, it's no Zonda R. The Zonda R is a very forgiving car. It's probably one of the reasons why it's so popular as well. However, this is much more akin to something like the McLaren P1 in GT Sport. Much twitchier, much more focused, of course, but it can definitely bite back. And of course that's the case with a lot of the greatest cars around. They do tend to be challenging. They demand more respect. So to me that was never a downside. But to some more entry-level drivers who saw people using it in a lobby and thought, oh, I'll use that car because it's clearly good, spend 2 million on the thing instead of something like a 787B and jump into it and find that, oh, I actually can't drive this car that well, especially fully tuned with, I believe it was something like 1100 horsepower. So for me, I would actually love to see the FXX come back. I would honestly choose this over an FXXK, and that's probably crazy to many people because a lot of people choose the new thing, especially when it's more powerful, etc. But to me, I just like the charm of this car. It almost feels like a strangely analog car for something that is unarguably very digital, but to me it brings alive the spirit of stuff like the F40 LM and the F50 GT in a pretty cool way, and it's always among the fastest cars in any game it's featured in, from this to Forza to even Project Gotham. But that's it for my thoughts on the FXX. Of course, tell me down below, did you love this car? Have you maybe never driven it in the older games? Either way, give me your thoughts down below, and personally I think this one has a decent chance of coming back. I wouldn't say it's the strongest, but I could certainly see it happening. Overall though, that's it for this pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.